If you've been watching the channel for a while, you have seen me use a guillotine tool or a smithing magician at the end. These are very handy tools when something needs to be butchered or for forming a tenon or a lot of other uses, just depending on the dies that you put in them. So today I thought I'd take a minute to explain what a guillotine tool is and show you a couple of options and maybe get started on making one, but I don't know if we'll finish making it today or not, so we'll see how that goes. Just like the name implies, a guillotine tool just runs straight up and down in a track like a guillotine. Only they usually aren't used just for cutting. You can put cutting dies in them. This one has some gentle fullering and swedging dies, so the top is a fuller, the bottom is a swedge, and these are used for shaping gouges is what I use them for. You could use them for anything that needed a little curve in it though. And this one with this round shank actually goes under the fly press. But the bottom die is removable, so you can put a whole different set of dies, different configurations, just whatever it is you need in there. And this is a simple shop-made tool with welded up plate for the guides, and it's just very simple. Really quite easy if you're comfortable fabricating. This one is virtually the same tool, just uses a different size die stock, and they're a little shorter and stubbier, and it's got a shank so this one can go on my anvil. This other guillotine tool, which is the nicest one and the one that we use most of the time, is the Smithin Magician. And the only thing that makes it a Smithin Magician is that it was sold under that name. That's a brand name. Guillotine tool is the type of tool, and Smithin Magician was just one brand that was sold. And again, it has interchangeable dies. In this case, these are 3/4 by 2. So if you can find 3/4 by 2 steel that you like for dies, you can make all the dies you want. The Smithin Magician is actually a riveted together tool, and then it is bolted to the base plate. The only arc weld or modern weld of any kind is to the base here, just to hold a hardy shank on the base. But you can make dies for swedging pipe down. The butchers are the dies I use most of the time, and fullers are very easily made. But again, use your imagination. You can make all sorts of different dies to fit guillotine tools. Now the Smithin Magician, like I say, was sold under that name, and it was sold by, I think it was Jerry Hoffman at the Blacksmith's Journal. And while I believe the Blacksmith Journal still has a website and you can download copies of the magazine that he was printing, and it's a very good source, lots of really good information, good drawings in there, and I recommend it if that's still available. I don't think he's still selling the Smithin Magician. The last time I looked, I didn't see it on the website. It was a pretty nice kit though. This is the Smithin Magician 3, so it's the third version of it. I don't know if there was ever a 4 or not. And it came in a box with instructions, because you had to assemble it. It was a kit. I just happen to have a spare one here. It shows all sorts of die configurations you can use, how to assemble the whole thing. It has a mild steel die that you use to help putting it together, but the parts are all water jet or laser cut, plasma cut, something like that. So if you're making a bunch of these for a club project or something like that, there's lots of designs out there on the internet. You might find one that you like, that you want to have cut out. But the ones I'm going to talk about shop making are going to be quick and dirty ones, more like this version or this version, just to be able to get one made, and they are completely functional. They just may not be as clean and pretty as the Smithin Magician was. But it came with all the parts of the box, including some shims, so you didn't bind your dies up. Let's take a look at making a simple fabricated guillotine tool. Most of these tools are fabricated. They're a cutting, welding job, maybe a little drilling, maybe a little grinding, but there's little or no forge work involved in any of the guillotine tools that I've seen. But I do have plans for an all forged version. So if you don't have fabrication equipment, don't despair. I think we can take care of you, but it's going to be a lot of work because it'll be heavy stock, big holes to slit and drift, some forge welding involved, some heavy tenoning and riveting, things like that. But I think we can do it, and I think we can make a really nice guillotine tool that way. Just not today. That'll be a future video. Today, we are going to make, like I say, the simple fabricated one. And the place to start with any guillotine tool is with your die stock. If you have some sort of a salvaged or secondhand material, start with that and make sure you have enough of that to make the dies that you want. If it's salvaged material, you might never be able to find that size again, and then you're stuck and you have to make another guillotine tool to go to the next size of material that you salvage. So I'm going to start with new material. This is 3/4 by 1.5 4140. I think you can get this same size in S7, 01, probably several other types of steel. Readily available. I can't imagine you'll ever not be able to get it. You can also get it in mild steel, and you can make mild steel dies, and we'll talk a little bit more about that hopefully at the end of the video. But this is just what I chose to make. This is going to be a little bit smaller guillotine tool. The Smithin Magician uses 3/4 by 2, and I certainly could make another guillotine tool to use that size dies, but I just decided to make something a little smaller, a little lighter, a little more compact, because usually you're not using that full width of the die anyways. Although with this method, you do lose a little bit of useful die on the edges because of the guide system. So you really only have about 1 inch of usable die. So you'd be able to forge 1-inch bar, wide bar in this, and that's about it. So it is a smaller guillotine tool. The Smithin Magician can go wider. And you can make this wider. You can make this any size you want. If you want to make this with 1-inch by 3-inch dies, you can, but that's starting to get heavy, and that material gets a lot more expensive. This is a more affordable size, so that's why one of the reasons I picked it. So the idea is to create a track system that this die will slide in, and that track system will be made up, and of course the die will be cut into 2 pieces, a top and a bottom die when we're done. But I'm going to do that out of 2 pieces of 1/4 by 1 stock, 2 pieces of 3/4 inch square bar, and 2 more pieces of 1/4 by 1 stock. And the idea here then is that this die will slide up and down in this. And you need to make sure that it'll slide. If you weld this up too tight, your die won't slide. If you just weld the outer edges, it'll probably bow out, and that's one way to get your clearance. Another way would be to grind this a little bit before you weld it up. But I'm just going to go ahead and wrap these in the die in a piece of paper and stack this up just like this with the die wrapped in paper, and that will give me a shim clearance all the way around that. I just got this handy dandy shipping paper from McMaster-Carr. I'm going to roll that up in. And side to side, this doesn't matter much because these will be independent pieces until I weld it to the base. So I'm not too worried about that right now. Matter of fact, it doesn't really need to shim on this side right now either. This is just to hold it all together so that it's easier to weld. And it's not really a great big deal at this point. What does matter is that you get all of the side pieces flush. And if they're too long, make them hang over the top because you can trim them at the top. At the bottom, I'm going to weld up before I do any trimming. And you can grind and bevel these off and go for really nice flush welds if you want to. Just whatever it is you want to do with it. I'm making this one fairly quick and simple, so I did not take the time to bevel all these. But running a bevel down here would make it a little bit cleaner weld. Now when I weld this, if you just weld the back, this is definitely going to open up some more. And it is leaning this way a little bit because of the paper's holding this side up, but there's no paper here. And that's okay because that helps give us our clearance. So when I weld it, I'm going to make sure I weld here and here where there is a bevel and get that welded nicely first, and then I'll come back and just put a few welds in the back here. We'll just see what mood I'm in while I weld it. But I'm not going to make you watch me weld that. There's no reason for you to watch a bunch of sparks and the arc from the welder because you won't see the puddle anyways. So I will be right back. Did you miss me? You didn't even know I was gone. So I've welded this up, and I've just put 3 little welds on the side. That's really all this needs. This is not a high stress thing. As long as it's welded up well enough to allow this to slide up and down, you should be just fine. But you are certainly welcome to weld that completely. And the truth is, I'll probably go back and weld it completely. The next thing to do is put it on a base plate. And I have beveled this off here just to make sure I get a better weld there. You're going to want to square this up. I can tell this one's a little bit lopsided. This is someplace you may want to use a magnet to hold things square, but I'm going to leave it clamped so that my die slides up and down on the guides as precisely as it possibly can. Like I say, a little square wouldn't be a bad idea to check this with. Yeah, pretty good. I'll check that again when I weld it, so I'm going to go back over and weld that up. But it's really this simple to make a very basic guillotine tool. They can be as fancy as you want, but this will get the job done. So this has been welded to a base plate, and like I say, it's fairly ugly at the moment. You can do however much cleanup you want. Now we got to get the die out though, so that's our next chore. And this shouldn't be too tough. We should be able to just clamp this end up in the vise and tap on this and drive this off of here. And then with the paper out, it should slide up and down just fine. This thing's still kind of hot, so I'm not ready to touch it with my bare hands yet. So the next thing to do is to actually make a die out of this thing, but it works very nicely. Slides up and down, just a little bit of a rattling fit, that's just fine. It will be a completely usable guillotine tool. Yes, it's a little bit ugly. Like I say, this is a quick down and dirty tool, not a high precision tool. Well, let's make a butcher out of this, since that's my most used die. Now, the butcher from the Smithin Magician is at a 70-degree angle, so that's what I want to do with this. And that die is about 1 3/4 inches long, but these are also a longer set of dies overall. They're about 7. But I still think that's not a bad height to start with. And if you lay this out just like that and cut this, you end up with, by flipping this around, you end up with both dies in one cut. Now I'm not going to cut this with a hacksaw or angle grinder. I'm going to do it on the chop saw. If you've got a bandsaw that will set a precise angle, that would be great. You can cut it with a hacksaw, lay it out vertically on both sides so you got a line to follow. There's no reason you can't do that. But chop saw I can set, and it's pretty accurate, so we're just going to do that real quick. And once again, you don't need to watch the sparks from the chop saw, so I'll be right back. Here's our very quick, very simple guillotine tool. A nice butchering die. This is just a matter of cutting it off with a chop saw, bandsaw, however you make a square cut, but make sure it is a square cut so that these dies come together all the way across. If your cut's not square and they touch one corner, you're not going to end up with clean shoulders, and that might cause problems in your forgings. So take the time to get them square. If you don't cut square, file or grind square. Also round this corner over a little bit. That shouldn't be a sharp cutting edge. But those slide in there very nicely, slide up and down. There's not too much slop or play in there. That's just perfect as far as I'm concerned. So that's a completely functional tool. Could you make that a little nicer? Certainly you could. If you're a better fabricator than I am and want to take the time, well, if I wanted to take the time, I could have done a cleaner job. I just wanted to show you real quick how you can approach this. Certainly take your time and do a little bit better job than this. In fact, I'll probably clean this one up some more anyways. But another thing you could do to this, if you want full width of the dies, remember our little track here takes a 1/4 inch off each side. So if you came in here and took a 1/4 inch out here, you would still have your guide material up here where you need it. Trying to draw upside down here doesn't work. But anyways, cut a little window in there that's big enough for whatever height of material you might get in there. And that will give you a little better width if you need it. You could also weld a little piece in right at the top of the window to provide a little bit more support for the whole structure, but I don't really think that's necessary. This should be fine. I've used them like this. The one that goes in the fly press and that other one I showed you for the anvil for years, and they don't show any sign of bending, bowing, or getting out of alignment or anything else, so it works just fine. Just like a guillotine. This is just one approach, and it's, in my opinion, one of the simpler approaches. There's another fairly simple approach that a lot of people take, and I'm going to do a version of that maybe tomorrow, just so we can look at a couple of different versions of guillotine tools. But that uses tubing, and this becomes an issue of matching tubing size with die stock size. And I have only a limited supply of tubing since I don't do a lot of fabrication. I don't keep a lot around. So I would have to look at the tubing, then go see if I can find die stock that fits the tubing, then decide if it's really what I want. But this is all your channel. You just have to cut a window out of it for the dies, and then they slide in here just fine. And we're going to look at a version of that that doesn't actually use tubing. We're going to make the tubing, because I don't have tubing this size. Again, the other problem with tubing is it's frequently round corners on the inside, so you have to round the corners of every set of dies you make. That gets to be a nuisance. And a lot of tubing has a weld seam in the side of it. This piece actually looks pretty good, but if you've got a weld seam that's going to cause you problems, you got to file that out on the inside of the tubing. And I don't know if it's worth it. It's easy enough to weld up some little square bars, or little flat bars I should say, and make a little piece of tubing, and we'll talk about that when I show you this next version. So that's just a quick look at guillotine tools and a quick look at a down and dirty guillotine tool that'll get you started. After we do this next version, we will then look at making various dies for the guillotine tool. Lots and lots of dies. Fullers, swedges, pinning tools, butchers, cut-off tools. I just can't even think of all the different possibilities right now. There are so many things you can do to make good, useful tools that go in a guillotine tool. I like traditional stuff in the shop. I like traditional bottom tools and top tools. But this is one of the handiest things that you will ever make for your blacksmith shop. You may want them in different sizes. If not, this one may be a little bit smaller than you want. You may want to go to 3/4 by 2 inch wide material like the Smithin Magician is. That's very handy, and only rarely do I wish it was bigger. The one I made for use under the fly press is considerably beefier. It is 1¼ inch by 2½ die material, and I think that's just more die than I need at the anvil. Remember, you have to overcome the inertia of this die every time you hit it with a hammer. And the bigger the die is, the more work that's going to be. So smaller dies can be a benefit. Too small a die, on the other hand, you stand a risk of bowing the die when you strike it, and if you start bending your die, you're just kind of out of business. It's going to get stuck. Now, I talked about mild steel for dies at the beginning. I mentioned it, said I'd try to get back to it at the end of the video. So here we are, near the end of the video. Tool steel or mild steel? I am definitely a fan of hardenable steel. 4140 is good, S7 is good, 01 should be good. Even a 1045 would be a good steel to make dies out of. Anything that is tougher, even if you don't harden this, it's already a harder steel. It's already going to put up with more abuse in its annealed state than mild steel will. But if you take the time to harden and temper these properly, they're going to perform for years and years and years. You can get by with mild steel. I've made them out of mild steel. The top mushrooms over horribly, and it starts to upset way down in here until it starts getting stuck and won't actually go down in the tool anymore because it's mushroomed or upset down into here somewhere, and it doesn't fit. You got to go grind it, and you spend a lot of time grinding and dressing mild steel dies, and it doesn't take too long before they get short enough that they don't actually fit anymore because they're not taller than the guillotine tool. So I don't think they're worth it, in my opinion. I think if I'm going to take the trouble to make a nice set of dies, I might as well make them last. I don't need to make that same set of dies 2 or 3 times. If I can make them one time, I'm happier. Yes, you can use mild steel. If that's all you've got, go for it. If you're familiar with super quench, that'll make them last longer. But if you can afford the tool steel, this is about $50 worth of tool steel to buy a 3-foot piece of 4140 that's 3/4 by 1.5 inches. That will make 6 pieces 6 inches long to make the dies out of, which is why I cut it 6 inches long. So I can get 6 dies for this guillotine tool out of it. That's a butcher, it's a cutoff tool, it's some kind of a fuller, some kind of tenoning tool, and who knows what else. There's options there. And that's not bad to spend under $10 per die set to make dies for your guillotine tool. So I think it's worth it in my opinion, but if all you have is mild steel, that's perfectly acceptable. It will work. Lots of people do it. Just be aware that you're going to have to repair your tools more often. Get out to the shop, make something, forge something, or fabricate yourself a guillotine tool. I think you'll get a lot of use out of it and you'll be glad you did. And if you can't fabricate, check back, because one of these days we're going to make one that doesn't require any fabrication whatsoever. For that matter, we'll probably make 2, because I've already thought of a second way I can do it just while I was building this, which gives you a hint what it'll look like. So stay safe, wear your safety glasses, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.